So that's life. And one of the things that struck me going to all the different forms of Judaism, like I've been in Reform synagogues hundreds of times, I've been in conservative synagogues hundreds of times, and I've been in Orthodox synagogues thousands of times. And often in a Reform and conservative service on, say, a Shabbos morning, they will sit around and they'll discuss how they feel about this week's Parsha. And this is much more rare in Orthodox synagogues, because the more traditional you go in Jewish life, the much more hierarchical it is. So the more traditional the synagogue, the less likely people just raise their hand and just pop off to the rabbi. The rabbi is learned and accomplished, then he's accorded much more respect in traditional Jewish life, meaning more traditional forms of Orthodox Jewish life, and people don't just pop off with their opinions. They don't feel like they can just walk up and ask a question. I remember I went with a secular friend of mine to Minyan, and I told him, this rabbi over here is very learned, very accomplished. And so my secular friend just went up to him and tried to ask him a question about the Torah, and the rabbi just brushed him off because the rabbi wasn't interested. So on the one hand, this will seem to liberal Jews, this is not egalitarian, this is not democratic, this is not the way we should operate, this is not American. But this is the traditional Jewish approach. It's hierarchical. God doesn't just talk to everyone. God talks to Moses, and God speaks to Moses in a special way that he doesn't speak to anybody else. Moshe had a unique relationship with God that no matter how many mitzvahs I do and no matter how much Torah I study, it's highly unlikely that I'm ever going to approach the same level of intimate communion with God that Moshe had. Not even his brother Aaron could approach that level of communion with God. So I know Christians often talk about how God talks to them and God communicates with them, and in many ways I think Christianity is much more democratic about God, and God will show me the way. For instance, in Protestantism, you don't depend upon the tradition to interpret the Bible for you. Protestantism basically holds that any individual can go to the Bible and he can find solutions to his problems. He can interpret the Bible for himself. And this is not the Jewish and the Catholic view. Jewish and Catholic views is that you need the tradition to interpret the Bible for you, to help you to know what you should do with your life and how you should believe about God and how you should wrestle with life's big questions. So Levi ben Avraham, Luke Ford here this week, doing Torah talk all by my lonesome. And apparently the rabbi and I have gone separate ways, so I'm looking for a new Torah talk partner. And this week's Torah portion is Acharei Mot. Not used to talking this long uninterrupted. Normally I can just kick back and let the rabbi carry the show. So, I remember when I was first coming into Judaism, I was very fired up. I'd been listening to all these Dennis Prager lectures, and I've been reading about Judaism, and I thought, yay, I'm so fired up. I've got a contribution to make. And so I'd start buttonholing rabbis and asking them really intrusive questions like, do you believe in God? Because not many, but maybe fewer than 10% of conservative and reform rabbis apparently do not believe in the God of the Torah anyway. I remember when I was living in Orlando, Florida, there was a conservative rabbi there who was a Reconstructionist. And when he came to speak to this class that I attended afterwards, a buttonhole, and say, do you believe in God? Do you believe this? Do you believe that? It was quite pushy. And I remember talking to Dennis Prager about how should we approach rabbis who don't believe in God. And Dennis Prager is a fairly traditional Jew. He believes in God. He believes that God gave the Torah. And I'm not able to recall Dennis Prager's exact words, but it was to the effect that you've got to know your place and you've got to know how you're doing things. So they're often very highly accomplished scholars at Shul, and it just wouldn't be appropriate for me to march up to them and buttonhole them and ask them questions and let alone give my opinion. And I can't say that I've always accepted this, because I kind of come from that democratic Protestant Western heritage, which we're all equal before God, and and also my journalistic training, I think, teaches me that I can go up to anyone and ask them questions. Like, here I am, a journalist, and I could be making, say, $20,000 a year, and I can tell some billionaire that he didn't adequately answer my question. There's kind of a level of chutzpah that's required to do journalism, and it's not exactly the attitude of traditional Judaism, where you give people more respect and more space if they've earned it through a high level of accomplishment. So God's picky about who he talks to. Virtually everybody who's accomplished is picky about who he talks to. Now, there are some people who always return calls. Say Jerry West, the former Los Angeles Laker, a great basketball player. Sherry Lansing, I think, ran Paramount. She would always return calls. That's the exception that proves the rule, that accomplished people, generally speaking, are picky about who they talk to. And I'll be even more open here. I remember for many years I went to Stephen S. Wise Temple, where Dennis Prager prayed, and I admit I often felt jealous when I'd see how close Dennis Prager was with, say, the screenwriter Alan Estrin or the psychiatrist Stephen Marmer, and I feel jealous, like, oh, I wish I was that close to Dennis. But I'm not nearly as accomplished as Alan Estrin or Stephen Marmer, or let alone Dennis Prager. So I was with the Nebushes, but that's all I had earned. So this week's Parsha begins with God instructing Moses on setting strict limits for Aaron. So it says, Aaron, your brother, he shall not come at all times into the sanctuary within the curtain in front of the cover that is upon the ark, so that he shall not die. So shall not come at all times into the sanctuary. I was thinking about various relationships with women I've had. Like, when you get a girlfriend, it's easy for me anyway to think, oh, I've got my little honey pot. I've got my little pot of gold. I've got my woman here, and I should be able to just reach out and grab her, and I should be able to just go to town and enter the sanctuary whenever I want to. But that isn't how life works. You can't come at all times into the sanctuary. So I remember, I think Rabbi Yitzhak at Shalom gave this analogy that it's very Jewish. If someone brings you into their home, they'll say, well, okay, you can't go into this room, and if you go into this room, don't touch this, and if you over here, there's someone who's got really bad headache, don't bother them. So Judaism's all about setting limits and structure, and that's very quintessential in this week's Parsha. So you notice my voice isn't the strongest, and there's something kind of off with my manner, and I'll admit I'm a little shook up. I assumed I was doing Torah talk with the rabbi this week, and he decided to cancel, and so doing the Torah talk on my own for the first time, and there's 2 people in the chat room and nobody's typing anything, so carrying the show on my own without any feedback, and it's a little more difficult. So Torah is all about setting limits and boundaries. This is something that's hard for me to do with other people. I tend to either accommodate endlessly, because I don't like interpersonal conflict, or I go to the opposite extreme and I just cut people out of my life because I just don't want to deal with having to negotiate with them and having to bargain with them and to reach accommodation and understanding with them.